Imagine a world where a woman can marry another woman, not for love, but to become the father of her children. Imagine a marriage where a woman holds the power to control a family's name, own its land, and command its destiny. A marriage designed not for romance, but to ensure a legacy can never be erased. And no, this isn't some modern reinvention of the family. This is the story of Africa's female husbands. It's an ancient tradition that challenges everything you thought you knew about gender, power, and what it truly means to build a family. It's a solution, crafted by women, for women, to solve a problem that threatened to wipe entire bloodlines from history. And it reveals a deep truth about human ingenuity that the history books tried to forget. This was a revolutionary act of preservation and deep ancestral respect. It's a story that was almost lost, a secret hidden in plain sight, just waiting to be understood to get why the female husband even existed. You have to understand the world that created her. We have to go back to a time before colonial borders carved up the continent. Two societies where the rules of legacy and oblivion were completely different from our own. In many pre-colonial African societies, especially among groups like the Igbo of Nigeria, the Nandi of Kenya, and the Zulu of Southern Africa, society was built on one foundational pillar: patriarchy. In this world, your lineage wasn't just about family pride. It was everything. Your name connected you to your ancestors, to the land you worked, and to the generations who would come after you. It was a sacred, unbroken chain stretching from the past into the future, and that chain was carried only through men. A man's identity was tied to his father, and his father's father. Land, wealth, titles, it was all passed down through the male line. Having a son meant securing your place in this world and your immortality in the next. A son was your voice in the council of elders, the caretaker of your property, and the one who would honor you with rituals after you were gone. But what happened if a man died without a son? What if a couple only had daughters, or couldn't have children at all? The consequences weren't just personal. They were catastrophic for that family. It was the end of the line. Their name, their history, their entire existence would just vanish. The family's land, farmed for generations, would be lost and absorbed by a male relative. The ancestral home would fall into the hands of others. The spiritual connection to the ancestors severed. It was a kind of social and spiritual extinction. Fate many considered worse than death itself. This immense pressure created a crisis for countless families. The desperation for a male child was all-consuming. A man might take multiple wives hoping to have a son, but even that was no guarantee. He could still die leaving a widow with no sons, or a wife who was past childbearing age. And in this moment of profound crisis, when it seemed all was lost, a truly ingenious cultural solution emerged. It didn't try to tear down the patriarchal system, but to cleverly work around it. It was a way for a woman to step into the void left by a man, not by becoming a man herself, but by assuming his role and his power. This solution was the institution of the female husband. It was an answer born not of rebellion, but of a deep responsibility to family, land, and ancestors. It was proof that when survival is on the line, the rules of society can be bent in the most extraordinary ways. So, how did it work? How could a woman become a husband, a father, and the head of a family? This wasn't some informal agreement. It was a formal, socially recognized, and legally binding institution. It all started with a woman of means and standing. This couldn't be just anyone. A female husband was typically a woman who was financially independent, maybe a successful trader, a wealthy landowner, or an influential figure in her community. Often, she was a widow without a male heir, a woman with only daughters, or a woman past menopause. In the eyes of society, these were powerful women who had earned a level of autonomy. This woman would decide to take a wife, and she'd do it by following every single tradition expected of a man. She, or her family, would formally approach a younger woman's family. They would perform all the customary rites of a traditional marriage. But here's the most crucial step: the payment of the bride price. By paying the bride price for another woman, the female husband legally and socially established herself as the husband. This single act was the key. It transferred all rights over the wife and, most importantly, any children she would have, to the female husband and her family line. From that moment on, the female husband took on the social role of a man. She became the sociological father of the household. She was responsible for the family's protection, its money, and its social standing. In the community, she was treated with the respect given to a male head of a family. She was, in essence, a man in function, if not in form. But that raises a big question. How did the wife have children? The answer is in the clear line this tradition drew between social parenthood and biological parenthood. The marriage between the two women was never about a romantic or sexual relationship. Its purpose was simple: have kids to continue the family line. The wife was allowed by society to have a male sexual partner, basically a sperm donor whose only job was to get her pregnant. This man was often chosen discreetly. He might be a relative of the female husband's late husband, or sometimes a total stranger, to make sure there were no emotional attachments or claims of fatherhood. The identity of the biological father was secondary. Sometimes it was kept anonymous. His role was purely biological and temporary, because any children born from this arrangement belonged, without question, to the female husband. They carried her name or her late husband's family name. They were her legal heirs. They would inherit her property and continue her family line. The biological father had zero paternal rights. In the eyes of the law, the community, and the ancestors, the female husband was their father. This practice was found in over 30 different African societies, from the Igbo and Yoruba in Nigeria to the Nandi in Kenya and the Lovadu in South Africa, each with its own local flavor. Among the Nandi, for example, an older woman past childbearing age would marry a younger woman to have heirs for her property. This wasn't some underground secret. It was a respected and core part of the social structure, a customary law accepted by the whole community. It was a sophisticated and pragmatic solution that shows an incredible flexibility in understanding gender roles, where the function of a man could be performed by a woman when the survival of the lineage depended on it. It was strategy. It was survival. And for the women who became husbands, it was power. Okay, we need to pause here, because it's really easy to get this next part wrong. When a modern Western audience hears woman marrying a woman, the mind immediately jumps to one thing: same-sex marriage. It is absolutely vital to understand that the African female husband tradition is not that. To see it through that lens is to impose a modern, foreign idea and miss the entire point. Let's break down the differences, 'cause they're huge. First, the purpose of the marriage. Modern same-sex marriage is almost always based on romantic love and companionship. The female husband tradition, on the other hand, was a social and economic contract. Its main goals were continuing the family line and securing inheritance. Love and sexual attraction between the two women were simply not part of the equation. Second, this brings us to sexual orientation. This tradition wasn't about lesbianism as we understand it today. In fact, the system was explicitly heterosexual in its reproductive purpose. The wife was expected to have sex with men to produce heirs. The focus was on the outcome: children for the lineage, not on policing the sex lives of the people involved. Third is the idea of gender identity. A female husband wasn't transgender. She didn't see herself as a man. Instead, she was a woman who adopted the social role and legal status of a man to fill a specific community need. It was an example of gender fluidity in function, not identity. She performed a man's duties, and for that, she was granted a man's status. And this brings us to the biggest paradox of all: its relationship with patriarchy. On one hand, you can't deny this was empowering for the women involved, especially the female husband. In societies that heavily restricted female power, this was one of the only ways a woman could gain the kind of autonomy and authority usually reserved for men. She could own land, control her own household, and command immense respect. She was no longer defined by her relationship to a man. In a social sense, she became the man. However, on the other hand, the tradition didn't really challenge patriarchy. It reinforced it. The whole point was to keep a patrilineal system going. A female husband succeeded because she found a way to produce heirs for a male lineage. She wasn't overthrowing the system. She was finding a brilliant loophole within it. Her power came from her ability to fill a man's shoes in a man's world. It was a complex and brilliant cultural negotiation. It let women wield power, secure their futures, and save their families from being forgotten. It shows that African societies have long created systems that were both practical and sophisticated, a flexibility that is often overlooked. This wasn't a simple story of oppression or liberation. It was a story of adaptation, of women using the tools of their society to build a legacy on their own terms. For centuries, the female husband tradition worked. It was a respected part of many African societies. a social technology perfected over generations to solve a basic human need, the desire for a legacy. But this intricate system was about to collide with an outside force that had no interest in understanding it. European colonialism. The arrival of colonial administrators and Christian missionaries in the 19th and 20th centuries was the beginning of the end for this tradition. These colonizers brought with them a rigid worldview steeped in Victorian ideas about morality and family. In their eyes, there was only one proper marriage, a Christian union between one man and one woman. When they saw women marrying women, they couldn't see it for what it was, complex system of inheritance. They saw it through their own prejudiced lens and condemned it as unnatural and immoral. They completely misinterpreted it as sexual deviance, totally missing that the arrangement wasn't about sex at all, and this wasn't just some cultural misunderstanding. It was a deliberate power play. Colonial authorities actively suppressed the practice. They brought in Western laws that only recognized heterosexual marriage, making customary laws like the female husband institution legally invisible. Missionaries preached that these unions were a sin against God, creating shame around a practice that was once a source of honor. The impact was devastating. Colonialism imposed what scholars call a double colonization on African women. They were already living in patriarchal societies, but now they had another layer of patriarchal control forced on them by the colonial state. The fluid gender roles that allowed women to become husbands were erased, replaced by the stiff Victorian ideal of the woman as a homemaker, serving her husband. Traditional social and political structures were dismantled. Where women once held real influence, colonizers often refused to deal with them, engaging only with male leaders. This systematically stripped women of their traditional paths to power. Over a few generations, the female husband tradition began to fade. It didn't disappear overnight, but it was driven underground, stigmatized, and increasingly forgotten. What was once a celebrated solution became a secret, a whispered about relic of a past that no longer fit the new colonized world. The colonial legacy wasn't just political or economic. It was profoundly cultural, erasing vast amounts of indigenous knowledge and replacing it with an imported morality that still shapes laws and attitudes on the continent today. The story of the female husband is a powerful reminder of how much history we lose when we only look through one lens. These complex traditions, full of nuance and ingenuity, are a vital part of Africa's and the world's heritage. Re-examining them is key to understanding the truth of our shared past. If you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be told, and that history is more complex than we're often taught, please support our channel by subscribing and hitting that notification bell. And we want to hear from you. What other misunderstood traditions or hidden histories should we explore next? Let us know in the comments below. Your curiosity fuels our next journey. So why does this forgotten tradition matter today? Is it just a historical curiosity? A fascinating but irrelevant piece of trivia? Absolutely not. The story of Africa's female husbands echoes powerfully into our modern conversations about gender, family, and identity. It serves as a necessary correction to many of the simplified stories we've been told about Africa and about ourselves. For starters, it completely shatters the myth that gender fluidity is a modern or Western idea. It's powerful historical proof that African societies, long before colonial contact, had their own sophisticated understandings of gender. They knew a person's social role didn't have to be shackled to their biological sex. This historical truth directly fights back against arguments, often rooted in colonial thinking, that paint diverse family structures as African. The reality is, the rigid, binary view of gender was the import, not the other way around. Second, this tradition forces us to rethink what family even means. It shows that for many cultures, family has been built on social responsibility, economic partnership, and ancestral duty, not just romantic love. It separates the idea of marriage from sexual partnership, an idea that is still radical to many. As societies today grapple with creating more inclusive definitions of family, the female husband tradition offers a powerful historical precedent. It reminds us that people have always found creative ways to build kinship networks that meet their needs. Finally, it's a growing movement, both in Africa and the diaspora, to reclaim this history. Scholars and activists are unearthing these stories, not to revive the practice, but to restore a more accurate and empowering picture of the African past. They're using this history to fight back against imported, homophobic laws often defended in the name of traditional African values. By highlighting traditions like the female husband, they can powerfully argue that true African tradition has always been more diverse and adaptable than the colonizers would have us believe. The story of the female husband isn't simple. It's a complex mix of power, paradox, and pragmatism. It was a tool of empowerment for some women, even while it upheld a system of patriarchy. It was a display of incredible social innovation, later suppressed by colonial ignorance, but above all, it's a testament to resilience. The resilience of cultures to solve their own problems. The resilience of women to carve out power in restrictive systems. And the resilience of a history that refuses to be forgotten. It holds up a mirror to a past that shows us a more complex, more fluid, and ultimately more human world than we ever imagined. And its echoes challenge us, even today, to ask ourselves, what are the limits of family, of gender, and of the roles we are told we must play?